and welcome to the Midterm Extravaganza Bonanza Part 2. I am your host, Pete Dominick, and joining me today, I've got three really great guests who have a lot of interesting, introspective analysis on the midterm elections. That's what I'm trying to do with this. Give you guests that are in kind of different lanes that are certainly able to talk about everything, but specialists on a few things. And joining me today, I've got Dahlia Lithwick of Slate on gender equity, women's reproductive rights, abortion type stuff. And also, she gives me an answer at the beginning of our conversation about what happened at the Federalist Society this week when an active judge, William Pryor is his name, he attacked or made jokes about Dahlia and Elie Mystal and also Mark Joseph Stern and others. Rick Hasson included, apparently. All journalists who cover the Supreme Court. This judge made jokes about them at the Federalist Society, and I asked Dahlia about it. Yesterday, I put her answer out on video, and it went absolutely viral, so you're going to love that. And it's a great thing when something from the show gets so much attention, especially from all the constitutional law scholar nerds out there that follow and respect Dahlia, not to mention all the gender equity type folks. Women's rights type folks. Well, so that was great for the show, and I'm really, really proud to have had Dahlia on. Also, Noel Casler is joining me, I mentioned. Great to talk with him about all things Trump politics and New York politics, where he lives just across the Hudson River from me. And pretty much nobody's better than David Daley when it comes to talking about gerrymandering and redistricting. He's a journalist, former editor-in-chief of Salon, and author of two very important books. Those are my guests on today's Midterm Extravaganza Bonanza Analysis show. I like to just keep changing the name because this isn't corporate media where we are workshopping and focusing a brand, the name of a show or a bit or whatever. No. We don't have anybody else to just throw these things up against. You just keep changing it. You just keep riffing on it to show that it's just a guy in his shed. That's what I'm doing, and I have three amazing guests. I may be a guy that spends most of his time in a shed and a lot of time at home these days, but my career has afforded me the opportunity to meet so many amazing people and do just well enough to keep them on the hook for an invitation back here to stand up. So please support the show with $5 subscription and tell your friends too as well, because nobody gets the type of guests as consistently as I do. The strength of this show is definitely the guests, and it can't do it without the amazing group of folks who listen and support it. So go sign up now, standuppete.com, patreon.com/Pete Dominick, and let's do it, shall we? All right, let's kick it off with Dahlia Lithwick of Slate. She writes about the courts and the law there. She also hosts the podcast Amicus, and of course has just recently published a new book, which is a huge hit, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. I read a lot of books so I can interview their authors here on this show, and then I forget everything I read and have to re-interview them. But Dahlia Lithwick appeared on episode 692, where I interviewed her about that book, and I gotta say, probably one of the most important books I've read all year, if not the best. Really, it's just such an important issue. Dahlia's such a brilliant writer, and Lady Justice is a book that each and every one of us should have on our bookcases. Let Dahlia know you heard her here on the show. That always makes a difference. She's on Twitter still, at Dahlia Lithwick. Let's do it. We are off with Dahlia Lithwick, who I am so grateful was available to talk to me for a few minutes. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Pete.
Before we get to the results of the election and your take on it, of course, the hot takes, I do have to ask you about your reaction to being poked fun of by the Chief Justice of the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals named William Pryor. He apparently made jokes about you and a few others who had been critical of the work of the Federalist Society. Is that right? Do I have that right?
You know, I'm going to confess that I am a working journalist the day after midterm, so I'm actually going to do my job and not take a lot of time with Judge Pryor's efforts that I gather stand-up comedy. He did bring the house down, I'm told, just lampooning journalists by name, a thing that, any code of ethics that I understand the federal judiciary is supposed to be bound by not okay. But I guess I will say this. The striking thing, in addition to the chief judge of the 11th Circuit poking fun at journalists and naming names, is that the Federalist Society are so happy about spiking the football. They love to brag to their donors, to their funders, to, young law students who are enthralled to what they do, that they actually seated justices on the Supreme Court, that they actually take all this big money and buy seats and buy Supreme Court, state Supreme Court. This is a thing they're proud of. Don McGahn brags about this. Mitch McConnell brags about this. So it's amazing to see the same members of the Federalist Society who happily take these $1.6 billion donations from a single donor so that they can buy seats and do so effectively, then get prickly when journalists write about it. So I think the real answer to it is, dude, if I may call him dude, you cannot both suck and blow. You're either really proud that you took all this big money in order to seat like-minded jurists on the courts who then do your bidding, but then accept it when journalists write those things. And so I'm kind of flummoxed, and I guess we'll just leave it at, I don't know of a single progressive or liberal judge who goes after journalists by name, because while those judges have federal marshals protecting them, journalists do not.
So well said. Thank you for that. Time to move on to something more important. Not that that isn't. It is this, the midterm elections. Dahlia, what did you think going in, and where, if at all, were you surprised?
Yeah, I was one of those people who read those pollsters and their certainty about how there was a red wave, and I was very nervous. And I will add, I know you and I have talked about this in the past, Pete, but the thing that worried me was the vigilante piece of it. I was really worried that John Eastman and Cleta Mitchell and all of the people who were the architects of January 6th were out there telling voters around the country, you should get out there and be poll watchers. And, we knew that there were folks in Maricopa County in Arizona, who were going to be getting into it with voters. And so I wasn't just worried about the outcome. I was worried that this was going to be choose your own ending. If you don't like how people are voting, hurt them. And it was the opposite of that. This was an election that ran with very few exceptions so smoothly. And it almost feels as though the sort of national electoral decision to move back from the cliff and to sort of renounce the worst forms of crazy and lawlessness was seen at every single polling place, almost without exception. So I just think, we can talk about the abortion stuff. I know that's what you want to talk about. But I just think the huge national zeitgeist of, I think I'm not going to punch someone in the mouth today, is something that we should be celebrating, because I think that, Donald Trump on down, that was absolutely being encouraged.
Right. Yes, that there wasn't that kind of violence, that there wasn't that kind of really intimidation. And that also a lot of people are saying, speaking of the bar being lowered, that a lot of these election deniers who lost admitted that they lost. They conceded the election, which is what we did for the first 100 years or so.
Yeah, no, I think that this is so singularly important that not only did they lose, but that people didn't vote for them. That there was no, it's one thing that they conceded. And as you say, that's astounding. But that the American public just has no taste for a bunch of people who were going into these elections saying that Joe Biden is not lawfully the president. Right. So again, I just think I'm so struck by, in a country where such foundational mistrust of institutions and such a deep, deep sense that, you should just Kyle Rittenhouse your way through life because you do your own thing and the law will somehow protect you, does not seem to have been at all the ethos going in. And moreover, I think a lot of the people who were running on that ethos did not get elected.
Before we get to what I'm now just calling women's health care issues, I wanted to ask you just what your thought, how you characterize, because you're touching on it here, the health wellness of our democracy. It might be easy, as it tends to be, especially maybe with progressives, that you take this sigh of relief, but we have to get right back to it. We are in no way out of the fascism has not died in America. What are your thoughts, though, on where we're at?
Yeah, I would commend to folks, Mark Joseph Stern, my colleague, has a really, really good piece up in Slate talking about how the reason the House will be lost is because of gerrymandering that the Supreme Court blessed when they blessed the Alabama racial gerrymander on the shadow docket this winter. And that in some sense to say, oh, the problems are cured. The problems are baked in now, and they're baked in not just at SCOTUS, but baked in, as you're saying, we have a whole bunch of people who won governor's races and who won state races that are going to allow them to make sure that voter suppression and gerrymandering go on happening. And so I think it's so tempting to do the same thing we mistakenly did after 2020, Pete, which is, hey, the system's held. The systems are like MacGyvered together with like chewing gum and duct tape. And we have to really think about, as I keep saying, gerrymandering, malapportioned Senate, lifetime appointments at the courts. Those things have not changed in the slightest. The American mood to tolerate some of the worst of that seems to have shifted, but it doesn't mean that the systems do not exist to be deployed in 2024.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the first people I wanted to talk to, one of the people I've been talking to a lot over the last couple of years, is David Daley. Do you know him? Who wrote the book about, Unrigged and rat fucked about our gerrymandered world. Anyway, let's talk about that last question, obviously, is the role that the Supreme Court's decision, Dobbs' decision overturning Roe v. Wade played. And it's also really interesting to note that, was it Michigan that codified women's health care, abortion rights into their constitution? And I think another state, like, there's no going back.
Michigan, Vermont, California. It was every place where there was a ballot initiative either to codify Roe or to somehow weaken women's reproductive rights. Every single one was defeated. And that's 5 states. So that was and sorry to cut you off, but it's in states that sometimes overwhelmingly voted for Republicans, like Michigan is an outlier. But even in states, in red states that voted for Republicans right down the ticket, women broke to protect abortion rights in state referenda.
What does that say to you about where we're at now on this issue? There's Mark Joseph Stern tweeting, this election cemented abortion rights in Kansas. That's the one.
Yep.
I was thinking a pro-choice state Supreme Court justices won their retention elections, as did Democratic Governor Laura Kelly, who can fill any vacancies with more pro-choice justices. Hard to see, he writes, how Kansas moves backward on abortion now. Do you agree with your colleague?
I completely agree. And I think that these state Supreme Court races are so essential. And, Michigan, we're seeing now, having swept higher office and passed their Proposition 3, which is going to codify Roe. I think people really learned this essential lesson, which is, if you're going to spike this back to the states, if you're going to take away a fundamental liberty from half the population and say it's up to the states to decide, people showed up. And in these state races, they really cared about who was going to be their Secretary of State, who was going to be their governor, who their state Supreme Court justices are. And those are races that I think Democrats have not necessarily paid attention to. And so again, going into this, I was terrified. I was like, every single school board, every single elections board, we don't do local races, but we did.
I gotta hand it to a whole bunch of progressive organizations like Sister District and Next Gen, working with and to get women, progressive women, young people. I mean, don't you think those nonprofits have made a really big difference? And it's hard for us to pay attention to the work that they're doing to get the vote out.
Absolutely. And I think anybody who's saying, oh, Stacey Abrams lost her race misses the fact that Stacey Abrams has reinvented how we get disaffected voters to commit themselves to, elections. And I think places like civic influencers, groups that are doing Gen Z and getting college students to stand in those unbelievable lines. We had college students in Texas and Michigan standing in line. So I think that there are amazing, amazing groups out there who none of the pollsters seem to have really referenced. Nobody took account of. And those groups got women, they got people of color, and they got young people to register and to stand in line and vote. And I agree with you. That is a ground game shift from what we've seen before.
Well, you made me want to ask you one more really important question. I got to get Dahlia Lithwick on this one. There's this narrative that, first of all, the Voting Rights Act has been gutted. It's making it harder for black folks to vote in states like Georgia. And yet the narrative goes, well, you're saying it's a new Jim Crow, but black folks didn't seem to have any problem coming out and vote in Georgia, and they won't in the runoff as well. But my understanding is the truth is, no, it was harder for them to vote, but they didn't let it stop them. I'm making it really simplifying it. But what do you think what is the answer to that from Dahlia Lithwick, somebody who says, it's not the new Jim Crow, and these people had no problem getting out to vote, so stop with that nonsense?
I think both things are true. Exactly what you said. There's no question. People were standing in line in Georgia and couldn't get water because now you cannot give somebody standing in line in Georgia something to drink, right? Nobody, I don't think in their right mind, would say that closing polling places in minority precincts or doing away with souls to the polls, Sunday voting, whatever the measures are that are supposed to increase voting, doesn't deflate the ability to vote. That's just obvious. That's the point. But I think that one of the things we consistently see is voter suppression begets voter turnout, because particularly people of color, and this is why it is the new Jim Crow, will just say, fine, you want me to stand in line for 5 hours? I guess that's what I'll have to do. And so I think that it can be simultaneously true, Pete, that they're absolutely attempting to do away with voting rights for felons, for students, for the elderly, for the disabled, no question. And also that it seems to have the rebound effect of having people say, I guess if you don't want me to vote, I better bring a chair and a phone charger and a newspaper and sit here for 5 hours. So both things are true. Doesn't mean that vote suppression is not happening.
Love it. Dahlia, thank you so much for joining me as always. Really, really great to hear from you.
Lovely to be with you.
All right, there you go, Dahlia Lithwick. I hope you enjoyed that. Go get her book, Lady Justice. Go follow her on Twitter, read her at Slate, listen to her podcast, Amicus, and let her know that you heard her here on Stand Up as well. Now joining me, coming up, David Daley, who you're going to love, talking about why gerrymandered districts, the Supreme Court decisions about them mattered more than anything else in these midterm elections. But right now, it's the great Noel Casler, who I just love watching, reading on Twitter, and certainly talking to him. Check out noelcasler.com. He's a stand-up comedian, he's an actor, he's a musician, and he is basically the Forrest Gump of entertainment. The dude has been on every live music tour and worked on all kinds of TV shows, including with the Trump family on Celebrity Apprentice. And so his perspective is always really interesting and honest and smart. And I just don't know how this guy knows so much and can reference so much and was in so many places and knows so many people. So let me shut up and bring you Noel Casler right now on the Extravaganza Bonanza midterm election analysis special thing.
Holy shit, Noel Casler is here, just back from the White House and just after the midterm elections. We have to do a much longer conversation because these are quick hits on today's show, but you got to tell me, how did you get keys to the White House? I'm pissed. I'm jealous. I don't think it's right. Go ahead.
I agree. I'm surprised I got on the list, but they had me down there 3 weeks ago, Pete, and it was the honor and thrill of a lifetime, and it was a wonderful moment. They reached out to some people that had, had been outspoken on Twitter and sort of seemed to be in concert with the White House and what they were doing. And I'm obviously a fan of President Biden and what they're doing. And ultimately, they wanted to get the word out in the midterms, get the good news out, get the jobs reports and the economic recovery and the fact that Biden created the Inflation Reduction Act and every Republican voted against it. If you just look at the facts, it's like looking at a sporting team. There was a lot of good news, and I applaud them for going out of conventional bounds, right? Because the mainstream media gets to go to the White House every day. All these other people get all the resources and the bullet points and talking points. So basically, they were just trying to make that stuff available to us and say, hey, if you want to help spread the word, you can.
No, it's very smart. And I mean, obviously, Trump did that. And not only the way that Biden did, Obama did it before him.
Yep.
There's nothing, in case anybody, I don't think there's anything weird about that at all, especially since you could go and say everything that you learned, which they'd asked you not to, talk about everything, which is what they do in all these, in almost any government meeting or strategy meeting, number one. And number two, you could go badmouth them if you wanted to as well. So
Exactly. If you wanted to hurt them, you could. And they weren't, they can't talk about actual like campaigning. It's the Hatch Act, but they can give you some of the talking points that the policy departments are coming up with, and it's all fact-based stuff. And I was very impressed at the amount of energy and enthusiasm and competency in that White House, man.
Yeah,
like that, I don't know why my dumbass is there, but it was impressive.
Oh, don't be mean to yourself. Don't have that. Don't talk that way to yourself. No, that's not healthy. But I got to say, I think I've always thought that Ron Klain is a very, very, very smart human being. Did you meet him?
I sure did. I got to go to Ron. They had a happy hour for us at Doug Emhoff.
Son of a bitch. You son of a bitch.
A deck off of his office on the old executive office building, and Ron Klain came out, and I shouldn't say this, but Ron Klain saw JoJo from Jersey and was like, "You're JoJo from Jersey" on Twitter. He was totally hip and fun and smart. And, they're good people. They're good people doing good work, and we got to continue to give them the mandate to do that. And I think we did that in the midterms.
I messaged him. He follows me on Twitter. I messaged him a couple times. He messaged me right back. I'm like, I can't even believe I'm talking to the chief of staff of the president of the United States, but he's a very approachable guy, and I'm psyched that you went there. And I want to hear everything or a lot more about that. But let's get to talking about communications and strategy. You're a New Yorker. You live in the nicer half of the Hudson River than I do, as people would say. But there's a lot of similarities here. And obviously you saw what happened in the House. We lost several seats, the gerrymandering, all of that, the tactics that they used. Noel, were you surprised?
Yeah, I was surprised. I think, it was overlooked. And I wish we had paid more attention, because I see what you see. We both grew up in this region. We're on the other side of the river. We're 3 and 4 in safest counties in the country, right? Not just in New York, but in the country. And the fact that, Ron Lauder was able to pump $12 million into these campaigns and sort of go after the kind of guys I went to high school with. I grew up in Putnam Valley, Putnam County. These people an hour or so outside of the city are buying this fear, right? The city, it's crime ridden, and you're going to drive into a Yankees game with your family and get carjacked. And these sort of like basically racist tomes work on this demographic. I saw it work in the Reagan era, and I saw the same playbook in this election cycle. And I feel like as Democrats, we didn't address that properly. We're not addressing the cultural issues and the brainwashing that's really taken place from the right and MAGA, because you see it, he's building an army out there. You see these pickup trucks with all these 2A signs and guns and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, dude, what are you talking about? We live in Westchester.
I want to get a pickup just to cover it with the most feminine everything.
That's a good idea.
Rainbows and just hearts and all kinds of stuff. And then watch it get destroyed. Exactly. When I walk away from it for an hour. What about the strategy to use crime? I mean, at one point, did you see that video where they were just chanting crime? I think at Kathy Hochul. It certainly worked here in Rockland, the 3rd safest county in New York. I've been saying that with everybody I've talked to. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Same thing. It worked here in Westchester. I'm in northern Westchester. It's that fear of the other. It taps into a visceral thing. And you got to understand, I'm 50, right? So I'm the voting age demographic that my parents and grandparents, the generation of before the generation that's here voting now, their parents fled the city, right? Many of them were like Italian and Irish immigrants and cops and firemen, and they were all getting out of the cities when the cities were abandoned in the 60s and 70s, right? So their parents came with this sort of kitchen table, basically racism, a xenophobia. That doesn't refer to cultures, but you know what I mean? That same sort of like, hey, we moved up here to be safe because I don't want my kid getting stabbed in Brooklyn,
White flight, they called it. Right. You just perfectly articulated what happened. And you just talked about my neighborhood, certainly Clarkstown, New York. It is Irish, Italian, firefighter, police officer, and everything that comes along with it. Am I generalizing? Yeah, but I'm not far off.
No, that's it. I grew up playing lacrosse against you guys in Clarkson. And it's the same thing on this side of the river. That's what northern Westchester is. We're not Scarsdale. This isn't the dentist and stuff. Like they're up here, but it's that, it's that sort of culture. And that's okay, but you have to address those fears, right? Because we haven't assuaged those fears.
Right.
People are getting their information sitting around the kitchen table. Jimmy's telling you a story how his car got broken into when he was in Midtown last week, and then then Tony says it on the job tomorrow.
Don't go into New York City. They're pushing people on the subway.
Right.
They're pushing people in front of the train. I mean, it's like...
Exactly. Listen, I won't keep you, but like I was at my 30th high school reunion a couple years ago in Yorktown. You know what I mean? And I lived in the city full time until the pandemic, and we're up here, and I was with somebody, and they're like, how do you live in the city? Like, I don't even go in there. Like, are you scared? I'm like, I live at 93rd and 5th. Like, I'm more scared walking out to my car in Yorktown than I am in the city.
Exactly. All right, well, let me ask...
It's fear.
Yeah, let me ask you about the big question I certainly wanted to ask Noel Casler was about what happens with Trump now. You've seen in the last 24 hours the reaction from a lot of right-wing ringers, and the media. You've got from Laura Ingraham, I guess Tucker Carlson. He hasn't thrown him onto the bus yet, but certainly the Rupert Murdoch media, the New York Post and the Wall Street Journal seem to throw him in the bin. I've always thought that's the canary in the coal mine when Murdoch really overtly turns on him and consistently. What are your thoughts on the media's reaction? What's next for Trump?
It's amazing to watch, and it's over for Trump, and he knows it. He's having a meltdown today on Twitter because of it. Rupert Murdoch created Trump, the political figure, right? And the New York Post created Trump, the sort of celebrity, the New York celebrity, figure. So it's so key to his brand identity that it's a catastrophic loss, and he knows it. So I think it's the beginning of the end for Trump. I think A.G. Garland needs to go in there and indict him next. I think we're already seeing the anointment of Ron DeSantis, and that's another show because that's fear. We're not out of the woods. But in terms of Trump as a viable threat, he can't do it without Murdoch's blessing. And I'll say one more thing. Jared Kushner is very tight with Rupert Murdoch. They go out on the yacht together. It was Rupert's ex-girlfriend that got Jared and Ivanka back together. So once he loses that, he's losing the sort of he's losing the information battle, right? Because what else does he have? Truth Social,
I think that's really interesting to see. I mean, you're saying, I saw your tweet about that because Jared is friends with him. Trump's probably, you said this, you insinuated, Trump's telling Jared to tell his boy, Rupert, the Murdochs, back off, and he's not going to. What was that insinuating, that tweet? Yeah,
well, because, Jared's a slime bucket too, and Jared's always played both sides of the fence. Like there's no love lost between Jared and Donald. They know who each other. It's a pit of vipers. They're all like that, and I think Trump is probably fearful of Jared because Jared is wilier and has his eggs in more basket. He sort of has that separate deal with KSA. He's got a lot of connections in Israel, and he does have the ear of Rupert Murdoch. And he won't save them. And Trump knows that, I think it's going to be like Knives Out, like one of those mysteries where they're going to start turning on each other, Yeah,
it's really interesting to see the results of the election, the right-wing media turning on him, other Republicans, maybe even his supporters turning on him, and then maybe the Department of Justice indicts him. And I mean, if all that happens, and it's got to happen, apparently, legal analysts say, like, really, really soon, I guess.
Yeah. I'm going down next week. I'm going down to Florida on Monday. I want to be close. I got some other things to do down there, but I'm going to go be around there because I want to be in the zone.
You want to pick up some actual shade and fraud.
Exactly. I want to be outside of Mar-a-Lago dancing a jig.
Well, if you are, you better go live.
Right on.
Thank you, Noel, very much. We got to talk longer soon.
You got it, brother. Thank you. Great seeing you, man.
Oh, isn't he always great? Noel Casler, noelcasler.com, at Noel Casler. Listen to his podcast, and check him out. We'll definitely be back here on the show soon, but let's get to my final guest of the show, and he is talking about what I think is the most important issue in terms of the election outcomes and why they are what they are. He's now a senior fellow for FairVote. Go to fairvote.org. He's the author of Ratf, the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy, which helps spark the recent drive to reform gerrymandering. His second book, Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy, chronicles the victories and defeats and state efforts to reform elections and uphold voting rights. And if everybody listened to David Daley's reporting and writing, we would be a lot more informed, a lot better off, and have a better understanding of our democracy, how it works the way it does. He is awesome, and I was so happy he was able to join me. Go say hi to him at Dave Daley 3, D-A-L-E-Y 3 on Twitter before it's too late. Let's do it with David Daley.
I've got the guy who should be everywhere talking to everybody because he wrote the book on everything that matters, books. David Daley joins me right now. You should go read his piece in The Nation that I've linked to about this. Thank you for joining me for a few minutes today.
Anytime at all, Pete.
Redistricting, more than issues, more than campaigns, more than candidates, gerrymandering is the issue when it comes to the House races. And is that right? And in what states are we talking about?
I think that is right. What it appears right now is that Republicans will probably have somewhere between a 4 to 7 seat majority in the U.S. House. Could be slightly less than that, could be a little bit more. But no matter where that number is, in reality, it is going to be within the number that of seats that Republicans stole and rigged through redistricting alone. So if you look at Florida, Republicans took themselves from 16 seats up to 20 seats in Florida. They drew themselves those 4 seats. In Texas, in Tennessee, the commissions that they hijacked or pushed to the breaking point in Iowa and Arizona, the state Supreme Court decision in Wisconsin, where a conservative Supreme Court, which was supposed to be the neutral arbiter of maps in that state, instead said, well, you're going to draw lines that make the fewest possible changes from the last map. The last map, of course, in Wisconsin, which rigged the state for an entire decade. Then you look at what the U.S. Supreme Court did on the Voting Rights Act and the maps that it affected in Alabama, in Georgia, and Louisiana. You can easily get to 12 to 14 seats that the Republicans and their robed allies on the Supreme Court and in state Supreme Courts effectively stole for them, and that made the difference in a close race for Congress.
When you hear all the postmortem analysis about why they lost, anything from exit polling, where you find out who voted and why, to the issues and the campaigns, and obviously to the candidates themselves, I'm sure it's relevant in many cases, in many places, but when it comes to these districts, is that as relevant, or is it the redistricting? I mean, what do you hear when you hear that kind of postmortem?
What I hear is a news media that just does not understand the fact that the power to draw lines is the power to pick winners and losers. And this has been the case now for more than 10 years, in which our horse race press corps simply doesn't get it. And this is the second decade in a row, really, in which the only thing that matters when it comes to the race for Congress is who has the power to draw these lines. We can talk about all the issues you want, and in some places those could matter. But we're talking about an edge in Congress that's going to be a handful of seats, and it is going to be within the margin of seats that Republicans not only stole, but in many cases, these elections were held on maps that courts called unconstitutional. If you look at the state of Ohio, voters in 2018 mandated a nonpartisan redistricting process in which the folks who were in charge of this had to follow specific neutral criteria, produce maps that did not favor or disfavor either party, and they had to produce maps that reflected the ideological and political balance of the state. The state's Supreme Court, not just Democrats, but a Republican Chief Justice and Democrats, threw these maps out not once, not twice, but 7 times over the course of this last year. And Republicans in the state ignored it. They held this election lawlessly on maps that their state Supreme Court called unconstitutional.
Wow.
It's the same thing in these southern states where the Voting Rights Act, you had courts say that these maps in Alabama and Louisiana, you had a judge in Georgia say the exact same thing, that a dilution of minority votes was a textbook Voting Rights Act a violation. The U.S. Supreme Court said, no, go ahead and run those races anyway.
To be clear, as a result of the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, specifically, I think, these states were allowed to rewrite their districts and write them around white folks, Republican, conservative white folks, to help win. As a result of that Supreme Court decision, these districts were allowed to be redrawn and not challenged. And that's really the story in many House districts and states, state houses around the country, certainly around the South. Yes? Am I getting it right?
Absolutely. So in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court eviscerates Section 5 preclearance of the Voting Rights Act, which had required that all of these southern states and a couple of other places that had a history of the worst racial prejudice when it came to voting rights had to run their maps and any changes in voting procedures past the Department of Justice. They did not have to do that this year. So Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, all of these states that had been covered that once would have needed permission and a pre-approval did not have to go ahead and get it. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was still there. And so Section 2 is where good government activists in places like Alabama and Louisiana use that to try to challenge the aggressive dilution of minority votes in places like Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, also in Texas. And what the U.S. Supreme Court did was when those cases, and in Alabama, for example, it was such a textbook case that a 3-judge panel, including 2 Trump appointees, said, oh, yeah, this is bad. You can't do this. Try again.
Ugh.
It goes on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, where even John Roberts says, yeah, this lower court here is applying the law correctly. But the other 5 conservatives said, no, we're going to stay the lower court decision. We're going to put the other map back in place, and we're going to hear a fuller argument on this entire case in the fall. And that's the Milligan case that threatens right now all of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that remains that the court just heard a few weeks ago. So if you start to add these up, right, you add up a seat in Alabama, a seat in Louisiana, a seat in Georgia, a seat in Texas that they stole through a Voting Rights Act manipulation, or that it might have been stopped in the old days. When you look at what they did to the commissions in Arizona and Iowa as they steamrolled and hijacked those commissions, when you look at what they did in Ohio, ignoring the state Supreme Court, and then when you then factor in the gerrymanders in Tennessee and Wisconsin, you can see really quickly that there's a dozen seats right there.
I'm going to stay one more on this example. I talked about this with John Avlon before you, but I'm in New York, and you haven't mentioned really New York yet and what happened here, but the districts were redrawn here, and we can talk about what that meant and how it happened. But basically, the Republican won here in my district, which was, I can't say it was held because it was redrawn, so it wouldn't be necessarily accurate, but it was held by Democrats for a very long time. But in my county, Rockland County, certainly, the issue for the Republican was to hammer over and over, create hysteria about crime. David, non-existent crime in Rockland County, where I live. I don't know anybody who knows anybody who's been a subject or victim of violent crime. And U.S. News and World Report says my county is the 3rd safest county. You could talk about homicides in New York as one metric, but I'm just not sure why a voter is more cared about violent crime in certain neighborhoods in New York, specifically just homicides, which, by the way, this past year are down. It's not an issue here. I believe he won, and yet Democrats and political pundits are going to sit here and complain about our not great candidate, Sean Patrick Maloney, for several different reasons. But more importantly, they're going to talk about the issues when the issues it was a ghost and it was redistricting here in New York, a ghost issue. Do you think I'm right about that?
Boy, I mean, violent crime in Rockland County. It's like when someone pushes a shopping cart into your car at the Whole Foods. I mean, come on.
Seriously, yes.
I've been to Rockland County.
It's really wonderful here. It's why the property taxes are high.
It's a very safe place. There's not a lot of crime there. No, that is a joke, and why these attacks work, and you and I have talked about this, right?
Sure.
I mean, whether it's critical race theory or whether it's crime or immigration, it is all too easy to gin up that kind of outrage. Here's what I would say happened in New York in many ways, right? You talked about the redistricting there. Democrats, and this is such a classic example of how the Republicans play this game of heads I win, tails you lose.
Right.
So,
I mean, by the way, that was just most illustrated in the most egregious way by a comment from former disgraced Donald Trump. You heard that comment where it was like, if they win, I should get all the credit. If they lose, I should not be blamed. Literally, it's heads I win, tails you lose. Right? I mean, just there. Anyway, go ahead. Say what you were. Sorry.
So the Supreme Court back in 2019 says partisan gerrymandering is a non-justiciable issue in the federal courts, and it effectively gives states a green light to do whatever they want to do. And so Republican states went hog wild, and Democrats said, well, we're going to go hog wild in all of the places where we can do it, which really meant New York, Illinois, Maryland, New Mexico. And so New York drew an insane map. It was something like 24 Republicans and 24 Democrats and 3 Republicans. Not exactly balanced at all, and they ran over some protections that voters put into the state constitution back in 2014 to try to stop all this. Republicans took it to the court, and a Democratic state Supreme Court properly ruled that you can't do this. This is a gerrymandered map, and it's unconstitutional. And they said, the legislature, you behaved so badly here that we are taking the power to redraw this away from you, and we're going to hand it to an independent special master, and we're going to let him go ahead and draw the lines. And so the Democrats in New York pushed too far and too hard. They flew too close to the sun, and they got really, really burned. But when you look at this from a national perspective, right, you can understand why they did it, because they had to try to make a couple of seats back that they were going to not get any other way, knowing that Republicans in other states were going to do the same thing, and knowing that the battle for Congress was going to be very, very close. It backfired on Democrats in New York. Republicans in Ohio and Florida got away with it. And that's the story of the control for Congress.
And that is the most important storyline, really. And yet, in all of cable news segments, whether it's 4 minutes or 10 minutes, that might get mentioned at the top as part of the list. But then they go on and on about the issues and the candidates and the personalities and other things because they have to fill the segment. But all we need is David Daley, I think.
I think the Beatles said that best, right? And,
thank you very much, sir. Awesome.
Anytime, my friend.
All right, there he goes, David Daley at Dave Daley 3. Go get his books. Go follow him on Twitter. Support the organization FairVote. And that is all I've got for you. Dahlia Lithwick, Noel Casler, and David Daley. That is part 2 of the Midterm Extravaganza Bonanza. And I will be talking about it, I'm sure, a lot more this week. It was great to talk about it with so many of you on Thursday night at the Hangout. If you're not a supporter, you're missing out on those Hangouts Thursdays at 8 p.m. Always a great time. Go to standupwithpete.com right now to sign up for a paid subscription so I can keep doing this podcast and keep talking to these brilliant people each and every day. And let me know who you think I should be talking to. standupwithpete@gmail.com is my email. All the rest of the stuff to find me is on the links to this and every day's show. So go subscribe, just like John Carroll, who is one of our most talented musicians, Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter, wrote this song just for us. Go buy it, johncarroll.org. Support him, too. I'll talk to you on Monday. Love you. Bye-bye.
You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up stand up. You gotta stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it than now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.